The young seminarian entered the Vatican with a heart full of faith and devotion, believing that there, in the depths of the Holy See, he would find his true vocation. The imposing columns and the sacred silence of the ancient walls seemed to whisper divine secrets to those who dared to listen. Each step echoed on the cold marble, and the grandeur of the place made his spirit vibrate with a sense of purpose, as if he were destined for something greater. But there was something more, something he couldn't explain, an invisible presence that accompanied him through the corridors. At first, he ignored that growing sense of uneasiness, attributing it to the weight of spiritual responsibility. However, as the days passed, he began to realize that the fleeting glances of the other seminarians and the heavy silence among the senior priests hid more than just devotion. They hid fear. And it was on a particularly silent night, when the candles in the chapels flickered for no apparent reason, that he felt for the first time the true shadow that surrounded the Vatican. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. What were they trying to hide? Without knowing what was to come, he could not have imagined that his faith would be tested in ways he had never dreamed of, and much less that the answers he sought so much could lead to secrets capable of shaking the foundations of the Church itself. What, after all, does the Vatican hide? The first days inside the Vatican were one of pure reverence. The seminarian felt privileged to live and study in one of the holiest places in the world. The disciplined routine, the silence of prayers, and the grand masses filled him with a feeling of belonging to something greater, almost supernatural. He devoted himself to hours of theological study and meditation, believing that he was in tune with divinity. However, as time passed, a subtly uneasiness began to grow in his heart. The Vatican, which once seemed to shine with a divine light, now began to reveal hidden shadows. The hallways he walked down every day seemed darker than he remembered, as if the architecture itself conspired to hide secrets in the darkest corners. The air became heavy, and the candlelight no longer warmed, but created a disturbing play of shadows on the ancient walls. He began to notice subtle changes in the people around him. Other seminarians, once friendly and devoted companions, now avoided eye contact. Their conversations were brief and evasive, as if they were trying to hide something. The older priests also seemed distant, with looks that seemed to carry a burden he couldn't understand. He began to wonder if they knew something he didn't, a secret he wasn't yet a part of. One night, as he walked through one of the oldest hallways, he heard what seemed like a distant whisper. He stopped to listen, but the sound stopped as quickly as it began. He looked around, expecting to see someone, but the hallway was empty. The sound never left his mind, remaining as a disturbing echo. Was he imagining things? Or was there something, or someone, lurking in the shadows? The discomfort grew every day. The seminarian began to notice that his nights were no longer of peaceful sleep. There were nightmares, distorted images and shadows that danced in his mind. He saw figures in the corridors at night, figures that disappeared when he approached. The Vatican, which he had always considered the safest place in the world, was now beginning to feel like a prison, a labyrinth of secrets that he still couldn't unravel. Something was deeply wrong, and he knew that sooner or later he would have to find out what it was. It was in the midst of this growing unrest that the seminarian was approached by one of the oldest priests, Father Marconi. Marconi was an authoritative figure, respected for his vast wisdom and years dedicated to the Church. His presence, however, had always caused a slight feeling of discomfort in the young man. There was something in Marconi's penetrating gaze that suggested he knew more than he let on, that he was always one step ahead of the others. On a seemingly ordinary morning, Marconi approached the seminarian with an enigmatic smile. "Have you explored the depths of the Vatican?" he asked, in a voice that was both reassuring and unsettling. The seminarian, not knowing how to respond, shook his head. "There is much more here than what you see on the surface. If you want, I can show you something that few have the privilege of knowing." The proposal was unexpected and left the seminarian divided. A part of him was curious, eager to unravel the mysteries of that place. However, another part, the more instinctive one, felt afraid. He knew that Marconi was not a man of empty words. What he was about to offer was not a simple visit to unknown areas. It was something deeper, darker. Days later, on a cold and silent night, the seminarian finally accepted the invitation. Marconi led him through corridors he had never seen before, down narrow, damp stone stairs. The musty smell and thin air of the depths were beginning to tighten his chest, but he forced himself to continue. Upon reaching an ancient wrought iron door, Marconi stopped and gave a look that seemed to pierce the young man's soul. "We're not ready to go in yet," Marconi said calmly, observing the seminarian's uneasiness. "There are things here that you cannot yet understand." The seminarian, although relieved at not having to cross that door, felt that something even more disturbing awaited him. Marconi gave him one last enigmatic look before turning to leaving the seminarian with only one certainty. There was something very wrong in the depths of the Vatican, something he was not yet prepared to face. From the moment Marconi took him to that wrought iron door, the seminarian could no longer stop thinking about the catacombs that ran beneath the Vatican. Restlessness consumed him. He wondered what exactly was hidden behind that door, what secret could be so terrible that it was kept locked so deep in the heart of the church. The nights that followed were tormented by dark thoughts, and he began to avoid the other seminarians, focused only on deciphering the mysteries that surrounded him. Marconi, upon noticing the young man's growing interest, approached him again. "You've been asking a lot of questions lately," said the priest, with that tone that mixed paternalism and something darker. "Maybe it's time you saw what really goes on here." The seminarian hesitated, but something inside him, an almost unbearable curiosity, made him accept. That night, Marconi took him again to the catacombs, a labyrinth of underground tunnels that seemed to stretch across the entirety of Vatican City. As they descended the steep, damp stairs, the air grew heavier, and absolute silence enveloped everything, broken only by the sound of their own breathing. The rough stone walls, covered in moss and seepage, seemed to tighten around them as the room grew even darker. Deep in the catacombs, candlelight cast elongated, distorted shadows that danced unsettlingly across the walls. It was there, among forgotten tombs and endless corridors, that the seminarian began to notice something that would forever change his view of the Vatican. A group of nuns passed silently, with blank expressions, as if they were in a trance, and entered the iron door. Their expressionless faces deeply disturbed him. There were no words exchanged, just the sound of footsteps echoing through the tunnel. Marconi, who was watching the scene closely, simply said, "You're not yet ready to understand what's going on beyond that door. When you are, you'll know." The seminarian walked away, feeling that something evil was rooted in that place. The catacombs, which were supposed to be places of eternal rest, seemed more like a portal to the church's darkest secrets. From that moment on, reality began to mix with fear, and he knew his faith was being tested in ways he never could have imagined. After visiting the catacombs, the seminarian began to be haunted by a series of disturbing nightmares. Every night when he closed his eyes, he found himself walking again through the underground corridors of the Vatican, always following the expressionless figures of the nuns. The dark tunnels seemed narrower and more oppressive in his dreams. The shadows seemed alive, as if they were chasing him. But what terrified him most was the shadowy figure that always appeared at the end of each nightmare. In his dreams, this figure watched him from afar, a heavy, menacing presence that had no clear shape. She never approached, but her mere presence was enough to fill the seminarian with paralyzing fear. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart beating frantically, as if he had just escaped something very real. No matter how much he tried to push these images away during the day, they continued to creep into his mind, slowly eating away at his sanity. But the nightmares were just the beginning. During his waking hours, he began to have disturbing visions, especially at night, when the Vatican seemed plunged plunged into an even deeper darkness. He saw figures in the hallways, shadows that moved at the edges of his vision. Sometimes he heard distant whispers, chants in a strange language that he couldn't identify, but that filled him with indescribable discomfort. The culmination of his visions occurred one morning while walking through the corridors of the monastery. As he passed near one of the prayer rooms, he saw something that froze his blood. A hooded figure, in a robe that appeared black as the night itself, was kneeling in front of an altar. The words she murmured were incomprehensible, but the tone was unmistakable. It was an invocation. When the figure raised its face for a brief moment, the seminarian swore he saw his own evil reflected in the figure's eyes. He blinked, and when he opened his eyes again, the figure was gone, leaving only a biting cold in the air. Desperate, the seminarian tried to find answers in the old texts in the library, but the more he read, the more terrified he became. He knew that something was deeply wrong in the Vatican, and that the evil he sensed was much greater than he imagined. Disturbed by the nightmares and visions that haunted him, the seminarian decided to seek answers in the vast and ancient Vatican library, where books from centuries past rested on shelves covered in dust. There, among tomes of theology and historical records, he believed he could find some explanation for the sinister experiences he had been facing. The heavy silence of the place seemed to amplify the sound of his own breathing, and as he leafed through the books, his anxiety grew. One particularly gloomy afternoon, while exploring a section of the library that was rarely frequented, something caught his eye. Hidden among ancient volumes was a book that seemed out of place, as if it were out of place. It was a black-covered book with no title on the spine. When the seminarian pulled the volume from the shelf, a strange sensation ran down his spine, as if something forbidden was about to be revealed. Upon opening the book, he came across disturbing texts. There, amid prayers and religious rituals, were detailed instructions for demonic invocations. Shadowy figures decorated the pages, and the seminarian felt his blood run cold as he realized that many of the symbols described there were familiar to those he had seen in his visions. He could not understand how a book like that could be there in the heart of the Vatican, a place that should be the very manifestation of purity and faith. As he leafed through the pages with trembling fingers, he felt the presence of someone behind him. The seminarian quickly turned around and came face to face with a priest he recognized, a man who had always been seen as an austere but respectable figure. The priest looked at the book in his hands, and instead of scolding him, he said calmly, "This book is only for those who understand the enemy. You are not yet ready to understand what is inside these pages." The priest's tone was cold, as if he was revealing a deep and ancient secret. The seminarian returned the book to the shelf, but the priest's words echoed in his mind. From that moment on, the presence of that book and what it meant became a constant shadow over him. The seminarian knew that there was something terribly wrong going on, and that the Vatican was not the pure place he had always believed it to be. But what terrified him most was the idea that he still didn't know how deep the secrets that surrounded him went. The days that followed were of increasing restlessness for the seminarian. His visions became more and more intense, and the feeling that something evil was lurking in the Vatican was more and more palpable. But he still couldn't put all the pieces together. He wasn't sure what awaited him in the shadows. That would change one night when he would witness something he would never be able to forget. It was late, and most of the seminarians had already retired to their rooms. The seminarian, however, still wandered the halls of the Vatican, tormented by his doubts and seeking answers. That was when he saw from afar a group of men walking in silence through the corridors, carrying something heavy. In the dim candlelight, he could make out what appeared to be a large black box wrapped in chains. The scene left him intrigued and at the same time apprehensive. What would they be carrying in such a sacred place, and why so much discretion? Without making any noise, he followed the group, keeping a safe distance. The men moved with precision, as if they knew exactly where to go, leading the box through corridors that the seminarian barely knew. They descended stairs that led deep into the Vatican, until finally they reached that wrought iron door in the catacombs. the same one Marconi had shown him weeks before. The seminarian hid in the shadows and watched as the solemn-looking men unlocked the door and entered, taking the mysterious box with them. The door closed with a metallic clang, and the seminarian was left alone, his heart racing, his body gripped by paralyzing fear. He knew that, on the other side of that door, something terrible was happening, something that could not be explained by the faith he so revered. Before he could walk away, a familiar voice sounded from behind him. "You're ready to go in now." It was Father Marconi, who was watching him with penetrating eyes and an enigmatic smile. The seminarian didn't know how to react. I was about to confront the truth I feared so much, but at the same time, I felt like I had crossed a line from which I could never return. The figure of Father Marconi, with his imposing posture and enigmatic gaze, hovered over the seminarian. He knew that in following Marconi that night, he was crossing a threshold from which he could not return. The silence in the catacombs was crushing, as if even the walls themselves knew the horror that would unfold next. Marconi took a step forward and gestured towards the iron door, now slightly ajar. "You are ready for the truth," he said, with disturbing calm. The seminarian, although overcome with fear, felt he had no choice. His curiosity had surpassed any trace of caution, and he knew he needed to understand what was going on behind that veil of mystery. Following Marconi, he crossed the threshold into a narrow, dank corridor, lit only by torches on the walls. The musty smell was thick, and the air was heavy, almost suffocating. Every step he took seemed to echo infinitely, as if he were descending even deeper into the bowels of the earth. As they advanced, he began to hear a distant sound, a dark, unsettling chant, in a language he could not identify. The sound washed over him like a tide of darkness, making his stomach churn. Marconi walked ahead, impassive, as if he were already used to that environment. The seminarian, on the other hand, felt every fiber of his being screaming to return, but something greater, an irresistible force, compelled him to continue. Finally, they arrived at a large underground room, hidden deep within the catacombs. In the center, there was a stone altar, surrounded by hooded and masked figures. The seminarian recognized the black box he had seen being transported earlier. She now stood on the altar, surrounded by symbols carved into the floor. The figures whispered chants in a constant rhythm, and the seminarian couldn't help but feel the weight of evil permeated in that place. Marconi, at his side, turned and whispered, "This is the secret you were looking for. This is the truth that the Vatican hides." The seminarian couldn't believe what he saw. His faith, once solid, began to crumble under the weight of that revelation. What he was about to witness would test not only his faith, but his own sanity. The seminarian's eyes were wide with terror, but he could not look away from the scene unfolding before him. The hooded figures around the altar began to move in sync, as if they were performing a ritualistic dance. The ominous chant echoed off the walls of the underground room, and he felt the energy in the air shift, as if the very space around him was pulsing with an evil force. In the center of the altar, the black box began to emit a faint red glow. The chains surrounding her vibrated, and an unsettling metallic sound reverberated throughout the room. The figures around the altar intensified their chants, and the seminarian realized with horror that the ritual was not a simple act of power. It was an attempt to invoke something ancient, something that should never be released. The seminarian felt his legs weaken as he watched one of the figures remove a human body, wrapped in cloths, from inside the box. The body was placed on the altar, and the hooded hands began to perform a series of gestures, as if they were offering the sacrifice to an invisible entity. The seminarian noticed that fresh blood was flowing from the body, and his stomach turned at the grotesque scene. In the center of the group, one figure stood out from the others. Dressed in an ornate golden mask, she conducted the ritual with fervor, her words intoned with disturbing authority. He was the leader of the cult, someone whose power and influence were clearly immeasurable. With precise movements, he lifted a golden cup, which was filled with the blood of the sacrifice. The seminarian, paralyzed by fear, watched as the cult leader drank the liquid with an almost bestial fervor, his eyes shining behind his mask. Suddenly, the air in the room seemed to condense, and the temperature dropped abruptly. The masked figure began to tremble, and a guttural, terrifying scream echoed from its throat. The seminarian watched, horrified, as the cult leader writhed violently, his body being invaded by a demonic force. The masks and robes around the altar became silent witnesses to the terrible transformation that was taking place. The seminarian wanted to run. He wanted to escape that damned place, but he was paralyzed by fear. He knew he was witnessing something indescribable, something that should never be seen by human eyes. And in that moment, a cruel truth became clear in his mind. The evil he saw being unleashed was not just a legend or a story of fear. It was real, and now it was out in the world. The seminarian could not take his eyes off the macabre transformation that was taking place before him. The cult leader, possessed by a demonic force, writhed grotesquely. Their limbs stretched and contracted in inhuman ways. As guttural screams echoed through the underground chamber, the air was charged with a palpable evil energy, so intense that it seemed to penetrate the seminarian's skin and burn his bones. He didn't know how he got there, but it was clear he had gotten himself into something far beyond his understanding. His heart pulsed in a frantic rhythm as he watched the cult leader's body undergo metamorphosis before his eyes. The man's eyes, previously hidden by the golden mask, now glowed bright red, as if internal flames were consuming them. It was then that the seminarian recognized something familiar about the man. There was something about his bearing, the way he moved, something that made the seminarian's blood run cold. The golden mask finally fell, revealing the leader's face. To his horror, the seminarian recognized the figure before him, the Vatican bishop. The man he respected, whom he trusted, now revealed himself as the leader of that infernal cult. The shock was overwhelming. The seminarian felt the ground crumble beneath his feet. How could the bishop, a figure who represented everything that was sacred, be at the head of such a profane ritual? The seminarian recalled countless conversations, advice, and moments of deep devotion shared with the bishop. It all seemed like a lie. Every gesture, every word uttered by the bishop now sounded like part of a cruel deception, a sham designed to hide his true allegiance to evil. The bishop, now completely transformed, looked directly at the seminarian, his lips curved into a cruel, twisted smile, as if he had been waiting for that moment. "You've always been curious, haven't you?" The bishop's voice was unrecognizable, a deep growl that reverberated off the stone walls. "Now that you've seen the truth, you know there's no going back." The seminarian, still paralyzed by terror, knew that his life would never be the same. He had discovered something that was destined to remain hidden, and now he himself was part of that secret. The seminarian watched, without being able to believe what he saw, the demonic metamorphosis of the bishop before his eyes. The man's body, which had once looked robust and imposing, was now unrecognizable. The veins in his neck pulsed violently, while his muscles seemed to twitch in spasms. His once human eyes glowed an unearthly red, reflecting the evil power that now inhabited his body. The room, once silent except for the chants, now resounded with guttural screams and a shrill sound that seemed to emanate from the stone walls. The seminarian, in a state of shock, felt helpless. He wanted to scream, to run, to escape that horrifying sight, but his feet felt rooted to the cold ground. The bishop, now completely possessed by the demonic entity, laughed insanely. It was a laugh that cut through the soul, filled with a deep and inhuman evil. The hooded figures around the altar did nothing to stop the transformation. On the contrary, they seemed to celebrate the ritual, their chants intensifying into a macabre and mesmerizing melody. In the center of the room, the bishop, or what he had become, began to levitate slightly above the floor, as if he were being supported by an invisible force. His body, once robust and full of life, was now covered in thin, whitish skin, which seemed to stretch in a bizarre way, almost like a shell about to tear. With each movement, bones realigned grotesquely, breaking and restructuring as if their human form was being undone. The seminarian felt intense nausea upon witnessing this abominable act. His stomach turned, and the air around him seemed to become increasingly dense, suffocating, permeated with a palpable evil presence. He knew he was on the brink of something cataclysmic, that the bishop was no longer just a man. He had become a vessel for an entity that yearned to break free. Suddenly, the demonic figure cast a sharp look toward the seminarian, as if it could sense his vulnerability and terror. "You also have a role to play here," growled the creature in a multi-toned voice, as its body flickered like a flame in the wind. The seminarian realized, at that moment, that he had been brought there not by chance, but as part of a much larger plan, a plan that involved his soul, his faith, and his destiny. With extreme effort, the seminarian took a step back, trying to break the spell that kept him paralyzed. I knew I couldn't face that entity, not there, and maybe never. But before he could react, the doors he had entered closed with a bang. I was trapped. The horror he was witnessing was just the beginning, and he knew that somehow he would have to survive that night to tell the world what was really happening deep within the Vatican. The seminarian knew that if he stayed there, he would be consumed by the demonic entity that now possessed the bishop's body. The horror he witnessed surpassed anything he could imagine, a complete perversion of the faith he valued so much. His muscles were tense with fear, but the adrenaline that was beginning to course through his veins pushed him into action. He needed to escape. Desperately, he looked around the room, searching for an exit that wasn't blocked by the hooded figures who were still reciting chants in a disturbingly synchronized rhythm. With his heart racing, he threw himself towards the door he had entered through, trying to find a way to escape this nightmare. At his touch, the heavy iron door that had previously closed with a bang seemed stuck, as if something supernatural was keeping it locked. The creature who was once the bishop gave a cavernous laugh, a mixture of mockery and satisfaction. "Do you think you can escape?" roared the entity, its voice reverberating through the room. "You're part of this now." The seminarian ignored the words, refusing to believe he was doomed. Driven by survival instinct, he pushed the door with all his strength, screaming in despair. When he finally gave in, he stumbled out, falling to the cold floor of the catacombs. There was no time to compose himself. He needed to run. The corridors of the catacombs were a maze of darkness and damp, and the seminarian ran through them with the sound of footsteps and laughter echoing in his ears. He didn't know if he was being chased by something real or if it was his mind, now in shambles, playing tricks on him. His lungs burned and his muscles burned with exertion, but he knew he couldn't stop. Every turn in the catacombs seemed to take him deeper, but he had no choice. He had to keep moving. When he finally saw a staircase leading to the surface, he felt a wave of hope, however faint. On unsteady legs, he climbed step after step until the dark corridors began to give way to the dim candlelight of the Vatican above. He had managed to escape the macabre ritual, but the feeling of being safe was still far away. As he emerged from the catacombs, he knew the real challenge was just beginning. As soon as he passed through the last door that separated him from the outside, the seminarian felt the cold air of the Roman night hit his face. The cool breeze brought brief relief, but he knew that the horror he had witnessed still followed him like a shadow. The streets of Rome, silent and deserted at this late hour, seemed vast and unreal, almost as if he were in a distorted dream. His feet barely touched the ground when he began to run, driven by the urgency to put as much distance between himself and the Vatican as possible. Every shadow in the narrow streets seemed to hide a threat, and his now hypersensitive senses picked up sounds he couldn't identify. The sound of footsteps behind him constantly echoed in his mind, although when he turned around, there was no one. Paranoia was beginning to settle deep into his spirit, fueled by the terrifying sight of the bishop transforming and the weight of the secret he now carried. He knew he couldn't trust anyone. The Vatican, that bastion of faith and security, was now the very epicenter of the evil he had discovered. As he ran, his exhausted body began to give out, his legs barely able to move anymore, but fear kept him upright. He passed through narrow alleys, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls that seemed to enclose him in an invisible prison. The lighting from ancient Roman lamps cast elongated shadows, distorting his perception and amplifying his sense of isolation. In his mind, the chants still reverberated, haunting every thought he tried to form. He could feel the evil he had witnessed in the catacombs growing, spreading like a shadow over the city, and he knew he was in grave danger. Finally arriving at a deserted square, the seminarian stopped for a moment to catch his breath. His body was exhausted, but his mind was still on high alert. He looked around, trying to find somewhere to hide or someone he could trust, but he knew that any false move could cost him his life. The truth he carried was too powerful, and now he was a target. The weight of the revelation was clear. The Vatican was hiding an ancient evil, a terrible secret that it could never have imagined. His once unshakable faith was now in tatters. What should he do with this knowledge? The only thing he was certain of was that somehow he would need to survive that night. As the seminarian hid in a small abandoned church, far from the watchful eyes of the Vatican, he finally had a moment to reflect on what he had witnessed. Dread still pulsed through his veins, and the images of the macabre ceremony, of the bishop transforming into a demonic creature, never left his mind. He had dedicated his life to faith, study and devotion, believing that the Vatican was the pure heart of the Church, a place of holiness and righteousness. Now his entire worldview was falling apart. How could something so sacred hide such an ancient evil? Sitting in the wooden pews of the church, he contemplated what he had learned. The Vatican, which was supposed to be the safest place for a man's soul, now seemed like a labyrinth of secrets and shadows. He thought of the corridors, the catacombs, the room where the ritual was performed. It was as if everything had been designed to hide these terrible truths from anyone who dared look. The whispers, the chants, the hooded figures. It was all part of an ancient conspiracy, something that had been protected for generations. And now he was part of that forbidden knowledge. He wondered why Father Marconi chose him. Why was he taken to that place, to witness all that? Perhaps Marconi knew of his curiosity, of his incessant search for answers. Or perhaps the seminarian was just a piece in a much larger game, manipulated by forces he did not yet understand. Either way, he knew his life would never be the same. What he saw needed to be exposed, but how? Who would believe him? Who would dare question the power of the Vatican? The seminarian was torn between the need to expose the truth and fear of the consequences. If he spoke, what would happen to him? And if he remained silent, could he live with himself knowing that there was something so terrible hidden in the heart of the church? He was caught in a moral dilemma, struggling between fear and the truth. Days later, still hiding on the streets of Rome, the seminarian decided he could no longer stand still. He remembered every detail, from his first meeting with Marconi to the moment he saw the bishop, transformed into a creature from hell, look directly into his eyes. The secret he carried was too heavy to ignore. The world needed to know. The church, the institution that so many souls trusted for their salvation, was contaminated by something that no man should see. The seminarian knew that his life was now in danger. The Vatican would certainly send men to silence him, perhaps even the very hooded men he had seen in the catacombs. But even with all the fear he felt, his determination was greater. He was no longer the naive young man who had entered the Vatican with dreams of faith and devotion. Now, he was a man who carried a burden of dark knowledge, and with that came responsibility. He began to write down everything he had witnessed, his hands shaking as he committed the words to paper. Every detail, every sound, every sight. He knew that the only way to protect himself was to ensure that this truth was spread, that other people knew what was hidden in the depths of the Vatican. He didn't know how or who would help him, but he was determined not to allow this secret to remain hidden. His faith was destroyed, but in its place was a new purpose, to expose the truth, however terrible it was. The seminarian knew he was not the only one carrying this burden. Others, somewhere, must also have seen what he saw. Perhaps together they could bring to light the dark secrets that lurk beneath the surface of the world's most powerful institution. With a heavy but determined heart, he finished writing his report. The sun was rising over Rome's horizon, a new morning dawning as he looked out the window of the abandoned church. Although he was alone at that moment, he knew that what he was about to do could shake the foundations of faith throughout the world. And now, you who have watched this far, would you like to know more about this terrible secret and the dark mysteries that are hidden behind the walls of the Vatican? Subscribe to the channel for more horror and suspense stories like this. Don't forget to leave a like, as this helps us keep bringing you terrifying stories. Until next time.